Africans did not put this stuff up there. Other people did, people in the north. Yet, we have 600 million people in Africa. 600, that's more than the population of Europe, whole population of Europe, who don't have access to electricity.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Brady Dennis, a national environmental reporter for The Post. As we kick off our week-long series, This is Climate, I'm pleased to be joined today by Mo Ibrahim, a Sudanese-born billionaire, entrepreneur, and philanthropist whose foundation focuses on the importance of governance and leadership in Africa. Dr. Ibrahim, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
And remember, we always want to hear from you, our audience. You can share your thoughts and questions for guests on Washington Post Live by tweeting @PostLive. Dr. Ibrahim, in September, you wrote that the global climate agenda is failing Africa's people by focusing on emissions reductions above everything else and ignoring the continent's pressing need for financing to adapt to climate change and for the impacts we're already seeing from climate change. As we just saw in the introductory video, this is more or less what came out of the UN Climate Summit recently in Egypt. And I just wanted to ask you, since this just wrapped up in recent weeks, do you see COP27, as it was known, as a success in your eyes, a failure, something in between? How are you thinking about the outcome of that global gathering?
I'm a little bit disappointed, to be frank, because this was billed as an implementation conference, and we didn't see much implementation. The only something slightly positive came out of the conference was the acceptance of the principle of loss and damage. But even that, we didn't have any methodology how that will be applied, who should pay, who should receive the money, what basis. But at least the principle was accepted, which it took 30 years for people to accept that very basic and simple issue. But we didn't see much really, unfortunately, coming out. People are still dragging their feet. We have a very serious problem, and we're really failing to address it.
You know, you have written and spoken about the fact, and I just want to concentrate on this first before we go into the details of what came out of the recent UN conference, on the fact that for many folks in Africa and for many parts of Africa, climate change is, in your words, already existential. It's already a crisis of today, not a crisis of the future. And I just wonder if you could take a moment and sort of talk to our viewers about that, about what makes Africa uniquely vulnerable to climate change and what kind of impacts people there are already seeing in their lives.
Okay, I mean, we let's start with the fact that we all agree that Africans did not put this stuff up in the past. Even now, African contribution to the global emission is less than 3.5%. Very low, actually. And actually, the Congo Basin only, the forest there, sinks about 4% of the global emission annually, which effectively Africa is already net zero. So we are innocent. But the 10 most affected countries, 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are all Africans. And that causing a lot of issues in Africa. It forces migration as people move from the dry and desertification to more pasture areas, produce conflicts between herders and farmers, obviously. And that creates tension within the communities, which can end up actually being violent. And we've seen that actually, we've already seen that in Darfur. We see that in the north of Nigeria. We see that in other places in Mali, etc. A lot of tension, and many African countries also are not resilient enough to adapt with the changing climate. And so they're affected, and their resilience go down because they're being affected. It is spiral downwards. So we are really affected by that. And we also have a problem is that we need power. 600 million people in Africa live without electricity. Without electricity, there is no development, there is no education, there is no health, there is no life. Those people need power. And we have, of course, we need renewable power. We need major expansion of our solar potential, which is great, but also we need gas. And that's an issue when some well-meaning people in the north decided that they will not support or finance any gas projects in Africa, while they are happy to take away African gas to use themselves. I mean, that's hypocrisy. So nobody is paying attention to the real problem in Africa, and that was ignored even at COP26, ignored at COP27, because Africa has no voice in the global platform. We are not part of the G7 or G8 or G20 or whatever. African Union need to be part of G20. We need better representation, and but it's a problem. We don't have.
I want to come back. I very much want to come back to some of those issues that you just mentioned, especially how Africa produces energy and how it will in the future. Before we leave the topic of COP27 and the summit that just took place in Egypt, I think it's important to point out that for years, for decades really, wealthy developed countries have resisted funding for what's called loss and damage. And we should say for our viewers who aren't familiar with that term, that is essentially paying for the notion of paying for damages that have been caused by climate change, that the developed world has fueled climate change. This is causing increasing problems across the developing world, and the idea that there should be some compensation for that. We did see at this recent summit, a fund at least established to begin that process. And I wonder, first off, why now? Why, after so many years of resisting this, do you think developed countries at least gave some ground on that? And how significant or not do you think it is to actually now have a fund being created that can address some of these issues?
Yes, it took a long time for people to accept that principle, and which is really unfortunate. We are always late. We are always kicking the can, and that is not helpful. But even that fund to be created, as I said, there is no clear parameters there. Who is managing this fund? On what basis? Who decides? Who will pay what and to whom? So there are a lot of work still need to be done. We are not there yet, but at least we accepted the principle. That is a step forward. And this is our problem as a human race, is that we are always late. We are always late. We are always kicking the can. And that is not helpful. We need some urgency to deal with an urgent problem.
You just noted that some 600 million people in Africa still lack reliable access to electricity. And you've written that there can be no climate justice without energy justice. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by that, and how we, as a world, and Africa as a continent, balance the need for energy, the need for growth and development, with these very clear, threats from a warming climate. How is that best done?
Yeah, we need to have a balance here, and a realistic balance. And there's no development without power, actually. And so far, power meant emission. And you can measure the development of any country in the world by the amount of emissions they put up there. There is a very strong correlation, perfect correlation between emission and development. So we need to acknowledge that. And while we're trying to reduce these emissions, at the same time, we should not neglect the need for development in Africa. Especially that African emissions are extremely low. And as I mentioned, our sinking actually exceeds our emission. So we are already at net zero. One problem we have, for example, in Africa is cooking, unclean cooking. Where families use wood or whatever, wood chips, etc., coal to cook food, which is very dangerous and bad for the health of people and bad for the environment. That need to be replaced, need to be sorted out. So there is a need for us to really move forward. And at the same time, we need to ensure that also developing our green economy. We need major investments in our green economy and green power. One fact I really want to mention, which not many people know about it. Already, out of 54 countries in Africa, 22 countries rely mainly on renewable for their energy needs. 22 countries mainly use hydropower, geothermal, solar. Their main source of power is renewable. I don't think of any continent in the world which has that ratio. So we're doing all what we can. We building our green economy, etc. It's just we need to go faster and build more. Meanwhile, gas should be an acceptable transition for Africa. Gas has been accepted as a transition in Europe, in America, everywhere. Why not in Africa? When we are the less polluting of anybody else. That is what we mean by climate justice there. We need to be sensible.
So I want to follow up on both of those points that you just made. One is the fact that, as you mentioned, more than 20 African countries already do rely on some form of renewable energy. My question on that would be, what more can be done to scale those renewables across the continent? And then separately, on the issue of gas as a transition fuel, absolutely, this has been used all over the world, and continues to be. Folks who want to, scale back emissions say we should skip that step, and I just wonder how you think of that from the perspective of Africa. And finally, if I could just throw one more piece of that, I wonder how the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, has changed the supply and demand of African energy sources in just the past calendar year or so.
All right, let me start with your last question. The war in Ukraine, of course, has been bad for everybody, but also bad for Africa because it affected our food security. We have problem. We're already coming out of COVID with battered economies, and we end up now with a problem where energy prices are rising, and food really becoming a problem and more expensive. So it is bad news for us. No question about that. And of course, it's bad news for everybody. So that's something we hope to be sorted out as soon as possible. As far as the energy markets and situation in Africa now, Europe, which a couple of years ago decided that they should stop funding any gas projects in Africa because they are really very mean people, and they should stop doing that. Although they have not stopped funding, in their own countries. I mean, how much Nord Stream cost, how much all these coal power stations which Germany built after they closed down the nuclear energy. Of course, that's fine for them, but not for us. But now, European leaders are running around Africa now to trying to sign contracts and extract gas because they need gas now to replace Russian gas. And that's fine. That's fine. We have plenty of gas. We have huge reserves. And yes, we are happy to share that with the people who need it, etc. But we also need some of this gas for our own people. It's important because we cannot just completely at this stage rely on renewable. It's not enough. We cannot do it, and nobody else is doing it. So that is something really we should try to work on. We need a lot of investment, both in renewable in Africa, because we have huge potential for solar, and we just tapping that. We need massive investment there, and that has to come from somewhere. As you know, the debt market for Africa is almost, you cannot tap it. I mean, it is, we pay so much interest in our debt, it becomes unsustainable because you are always rated as at sub-investment grade, and this is another issue. But I always wondered why the poor have to pay huge interest in their loans and the rich pay so little. It doesn't seem to be sensible, and something needs to be done there. Before COVID, rich countries will borrow at 0.5% interest rate or 1% interest rate. Africa borrows at 10, 11, 12% rate. I mean, it's tough. How can you develop your countries with this kind of very expensive financing? We need to, and that shows actually the problems we have with our multilateral system, which is another discussion, because I think neither the World Bank or IMF are now fit to deal with the issues of the 21st centuries. We need to find a better role for them. We need to rewrite their mission, actually.
So, as you well know, Africa as a continent is very resource rich, and that may be in renewables or minerals, oil and gas reserves. My question on that front is, what steps can and should be taken to make sure that all those resources are developed both in a smart way, in a way that is environmentally sound, but also that avoids what you have written about as the resource curse that has plagued many countries in the continent and around the world? How do you ensure that African nations and, more importantly, African people benefit from some of those resources, and that the benefits don't just go elsewhere in the world?
Well, you really raise a very important point. Thank you for raising this point. The future really of green energy relies a lot on all these minerals, which are essential for the green economy. And we have like 70% of some of these minerals in Africa. And the consumption of these minerals is likely to increase by about 500% in the next decade, really to deal with that energy transition. We have huge resources there. Two things need to be done. First, for us African, to be a little bit more smart and a little bit more really reasonable about how we develop our own resources. All the, or most of the resource extraction of Africa actually has been really skewed, has been unfair, dubious contracts, not negotiated well. There was briberies, people were giving up resources for cheap bribes here and there. I mean, we had, I don't want to go through details, but you know what happened in Guinea with the iron minerals there, and there's so many stories. Congo is supposed to be one of the richest countries in the world with the resources they have. Yet it is one of the poorest countries because the way they mismanage the resources. That's why we have a fight in our hand to improve governance and leadership in Africa. That's what we focus on in my foundation, because this is a curse. And resources should be a blessing, not a curse. So we have some work to do ourselves. But also, our partners also need to improve their own governance and to ask the private sector to behave in a better way. Because we have a problem also with multinationals not behaving properly in Africa. Do you know that illicit financial flows of Africa is about $100 billion every year? That's more than double the total amount of aid given to Africa. And you ask the question, who is funding whom? Illicit financial flows, people are not paying taxes, people are mispricing, and all these are very respectable companies. And some of this stuff is legal because we need to improve really governance in a lot of our issues there. I mean, it is not right that people don't pay taxes and misprice their products and, you know, profit shifting. It's not right. At least now the OECD is looking into that because some European countries have been hit with the same problem recently, and now they are running around to see what they can do about it. Let us see what we'll do.
On the issue of governance, which of course your foundation focuses on heavily, we should acknowledge Africa is not a monolith. As you mentioned, it's a continent of 54 different countries, each of whom have different needs, different strategies, different populations, different goals, you know, different aims when it comes to both climate aspirations and economic development. And so you advocate for greater economic integration and alignment on these issues. Why is that so important, and what does it take for that actually to happen across a continent, you know, as massive and populated as Africa?
I think market size matters. And I always ask my friends in Africa, imagine for a moment that China, which has the same population same number of people as Africa. We both have like 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. If China was 54 countries, each one has its own regulations, its own currencies, its own system, where China would have been today? China would have been in the same place like Africa. Because unless you have the critical size which enable you to integrate your economy, enable you to have better deals with the other trading partners, and enable you to move from just mining raw materials into vertical and more productive processing, manufacturing, etc., will stay poor. So it is the project of integrating African economy is vital. At the moment, it's much easier to move goods from West Africa to China than moving same goods from West Africa to East Africa. It doesn't work this way. It doesn't work. And we have to find a way really to bring our economy. Of course, now we have an agreement to create this Pan-African trading zone. The agreement moving on is moving slowly, but we hope we're starting to recognize the importance of creating the African common market. We need to do that. And I just want to mention that when we say the resource curse, I really want also to applaud what countries like Botswana did, for example, which managed its resources really for the benefit of its own people. That is a shining example in good governance. That's something we need to salute, and we hope more countries follow that example.
So I want to sneak in a couple of last questions here if possible. And one is that, as someone who has succeeded in private industry like yourself, what more would you like to see and do you think is expected of the private sector in terms of addressing climate change, particularly in Africa?
Right. I think we need better governance. What is the purpose of business? It cannot be just making profit at any cost. We are part of this fabric of the society around us. We cannot succeed if the community around us is failing. We have to really think long term. We need really to thrive as a business in a thriving environment and thriving community. That's really essential for us. And that's why I think in our fight for good governance in Africa, we discovered that we cannot have good governance in Africa without good governance in the boardrooms of companies. Because you look at any issue, I mean, if people talk about corruption, but what corruption means? It means that for every African corrupt politician, there is a dozen of corrupt business people, because that's how it works. Politicians don't corrupt themselves. It takes two at least to tango here. So who are those guys? Who are those business people doing that? Shouldn't we do something about this? That's really important. I mentioned illicit financial flows. It's not right. It's not right, because this means kids don't go to schools. That's how business people need to understand. When you try to shift your profit and don't pay your taxes or don't do the right thing, this means death for some people because of failing of health systems. Kids don't go into school, means conflicts, means migration, means, so we hope that business really rethink what its purpose, what is it for.
So probably our last question here, but I wanted to make sure and ask you more of a philosophical question here before we ran out of time, which is when you step back and you look at the continent as a whole, both in terms of Africa's future for the development and for its people, but also for the perils that it faces in the face of climate change. Are you on the whole optimistic? What are your biggest concerns? I mean, how do you think about the future of this very important continent?
I'm really optimistic for a number of reasons. We have a much better younger generation now, and all my hopes really rest on this young generation. That young generation is better informed, better connected, better educated than our generation, and it is in their hand now to move forward. I've just published an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, the US magazine, called Africa's Past is Not Its Future, because we had a terrible past, but we need to stop thinking and complaining about our past. Yes, we had slavery, we had colonialism, we had the Cold War with all its problems. We need to forget about that. The future is in our hand. It is in the hands of our young people. And I am sure that will be a much better future. That's why I'm optimistic.
Seems like a good place to leave it, although we hope to continue the conversation in the future with you. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today, so we'll have to leave it there. Mo Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us today at Washington Post Live.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you for joining the conversation. To check out what interviews we have coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about all our upcoming programs. I'm Brady Dennis, and again, thank you for watching.